On March 8, 2014, an aircraft with 239 people on board took off from Kuala Lumpur and never reached its destination. To this day, no black box has been recovered. There is no definitive explanation, only questions that more than a decade later remain unanswered. At 12:41 in the early morning, Malaysia local time, the Boeing 777-200ER with registration 9M-MRO began taxiing on runway 32R at Kuala Lumpur International Airport. Flight MH370 was scheduled to land in Beijing 6 hours later at 6:30 in the morning. It was a routine overnight flight, the type of operation that Malaysia Airlines carried out regularly on that route. On board were 227 passengers of 12 different nationalities, predominantly Chinese citizens, and a crew of 12 people under the command of Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah, a veteran with more than 18,000 flight hours, and co-pilot Farik Abdul Hamid. The first 40 minutes passed with absolute normality. The aircraft reached its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet over the Malay Peninsula, automatically transmitted position data through the ADS-B system, and maintained fluid contact with Kuala Lumpur Air Traffic Control. At 17:19 UTC, when the flight was approaching the transition point toward Vietnamese airspace, the Lumpur radar controller transmitted the usual instruction: contact the Ho Chi Minh frequency. The response from the cockpit was laconic and completely normal. Good night, Malaysian 370. Those were the last words heard from MH370. 9 seconds after crossing the Igari navigation point at 17:21:13 UTC, the ADS-B signal went out. The aircraft disappeared from the air traffic control screens. Under normal circumstances, this would not have generated immediate alarm. The IGARI area is far enough from the coast for radar coverage to be intermittent. The controller's system simply assumed that the aircraft was continuing on its course. The Vietnamese controllers waited, called by radio without getting a response, and 15 minutes passed before they began to suspect that something did not fit. When they tried to locate the flight, no one knew where it was. At dawn, with no trace of the flight, Malaysian authorities declared MH370 missing and launched a search that initially focused on the South China Sea, the aircraft's last known position. Then came the first disturbing revelation. Sources within the Royal Malaysian Air Force confirmed that the aircraft had not disappeared completely. Primary military radar, the system that detects objects in the air without any need for them to emit any signal, had followed MH370. And what those recordings showed was difficult to process. The aircraft had executed a 180-degree turn and had flown back at high speed over the Malay Peninsula, overflying the island of Penang, before turning northwest to enter the Strait of Malacca. At 18:22 UTC, about 60 nautical miles north of the western tip of Sumatra, the aircraft left the range of military radar. It had disappeared for the second time. The aircraft's behavior during that time completely ruled out a conventional mechanical accident. It did not describe errant trajectories or emergency circles. It followed a route from segment to segment, passing through precise navigation points at speeds close to 500 knots, as if someone with full command of a commercial aircraft systems were in control. The conclusion reached by Malaysian authorities was inevitable. This had not been an accident. It had been a deliberate act. The question that remained was who had carried it out and why. From the very first moment, the investigators' attention focused on the only two individuals who would have had direct access and technical capacity to manipulate the aircraft systems from the cockpit: Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah and co-pilot Farik Abdul Hamid. Zahari was 53 years old, Malaysian, and had been working for Malaysia Airlines for 33 years. His service record was impeccable. He was known among his colleagues as a meticulous and passionate pilot, fond of building homemade flight simulators in his spare time. In the basement of his house in Kuala Lumpur, he had installed a semi-professional level flight simulator where he practiced regularly. Malaysian police confiscated it and analyzed the hard drive in search of files that could reveal whether he had been rehearsing trajectories related to the disappeared flight. The media initially reported that route data over the southern Indian Ocean had been found, which generated a wave of speculation about a possible premeditated suicide. However, later, more detailed analyses revealed that those files were residual fragments of ordinary simulation sessions, not planned routes toward any specific destination. Zahari was going through marital difficulties. He and his wife lived separately within the same home, according to people close to the family. He had also become politically involved with the Malaysian opposition and attended a court hearing the day before the flight in the case against opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim, who that same day was sentenced to 5 years in prison in a process widely criticized as politically motivated. Some analysts tried to construct a profile of motivation from these data, but no official investigation considered them sufficient to establish a plausible cause. Fariq Abdul Hamid was 27 years old and a co-pilot in training. He was in the final stages of his qualification on the 777. There was no indication in his record linking him to any irregular conduct. He had been photographed months earlier, allowing 2 female passengers to visit the cockpit during a flight, which violated post-September 11th security protocols, but it was an isolated incident with no serious disciplinary consequences. In the weeks before the disappearance, he was engaged to be married. The search shifted toward the Indian Ocean, near the western end of the Strait of Malacca, the aircraft's last known position according to military radar. But before that search could take shape, another revelation completely transformed the scope of the mystery. Malaysia Airlines operated its aircraft with satellite communication equipment from the Inmarsat system, a telecommunications service used by airlines around the world to manage text messages, voice calls, and data transmissions from any point on the globe, even from remote areas beyond the reach of terrestrial antennas. The satellite with which MH370 communicated was called Inmarsat 3F1. It orbited geosynchronously about 35,800 kilometers above the equator and remained in a fixed position relative to the Earth's surface. What Inmarsat engineers discovered when reviewing their records was that, although no one had used the system to communicate during the final hours of the flight, the aircraft had continued exchanging automatic signals with the satellite. Inmarsat uses a session verification mechanism. If a terminal remains inactive for a certain period, approximately 1 hour, the system sends it an automatic signal asking whether it is still connected. If the terminal responds, the session remains active. These signals are colloquially called handshakes, or because of the cadence with which they occurred, pings. MH370 had responded to those pings for almost 6 hours after disappearing from radar. The last signal was recorded at 0:19 UTC. In that time, the aircraft could have traveled more than 5,000 kilometers, placing itself within range of destinations as diverse as the Horn of Africa, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, or Eastern Java. On March 15, 2014, Prime Minister Najib Razak convened a press conference to announce this discovery. The world went from searching for an aircraft in the South China Sea to contemplating an enormous radius of action that covered 2 geographic corridors, one to the north, extending from the border between Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan to northern Thailand, and another to the south from Indonesia to the southern Indian Ocean. But Inmarsat engineers had extracted more information from those pings. Each signal contained a parameter called burst timing offset, or BTO, a measure of the time elapsed between the satellite's question and the aircraft's response. Since light travels at a constant speed, that round-trip time was directly proportional to the distance between the satellite and the aircraft at each moment. With those data, it was possible to draw concentric arcs around the satellite, each one representing the aircraft's position at the instant of each ping. The aircraft had to be located at some point on those arcs, but there was no way to know at which exact point without knowing the speed and heading. To this information was added another equally valuable parameter, the burst frequency offset, or BFO. Radio signals experience a Doppler effect, similar to the one that modifies the pitch of the whistle of a train that approaches or moves away. If the aircraft moves toward the satellite, the frequency of the signal rises. If it moves away, it falls. By analyzing these frequency variations, Inmarsat scientists could determine whether the aircraft had headed north or south. The recorded values corresponded unequivocally to a southern trajectory. On March 25, 2014, Najib Razak returned to the podium. This time, the announcement was definitive according to the authorities. MH370 had flown south, and its last known position was in the middle of the Indian Ocean, west of Perth. without wreckage, without black boxes, without confirmed survivors, without any physical evidence, solely on the basis of a mathematical analysis of satellite signals, hundreds of people were declared dead. Some relatives received the notification by text message. Australian authorities took over coordination of the search in the southern Indian Ocean, one of the most remote and hostile maritime areas on the planet. The sea surface, more than 2,000 kilometers southwest of Perth, can only be reached after hours of flight from the mainland, and ships need entire days to arrive. The first efforts focused on locating floating debris. When an aircraft falls into the ocean, it generates thousands of fragments of material that remain on the surface for weeks or even months. After the Air France 447 accident in the Atlantic in 2009, search teams recovered approximately 3,000 pieces of debris distributed over an extensive area. Even in cases that occurred in remote areas and with unknown position, fragments have always been found. With MH370, nothing appeared. Week after week, satellites, maritime patrol aircraft, and ships from several countries scrutinized millions of square kilometers of ocean. Periodically, satellite images that might show debris were announced, and each time the teams deployed to the site returned empty-handed. The absence of any physical sign was, from the beginning, an anomaly that did not fit with any known scenario of an aviation accident over the sea. The next step was the acoustic search. Flight recorders, popularly known as black boxes, emit a pulsing acoustic signal at 37.5 kHz designed to facilitate their location. The batteries of these emitters are certified to operate for 30 days. With the deadline approaching, authorities deployed the towed pinger locator, an acoustic detection system loaned by the United States Navy, aboard the Australian ship HMAS Ocean Shield. On April 5, 2014, the Ocean Shield detected a signal. Hours later, it detected another, approximately 2 kilometers from the first. The Malaysian Transport Minister declared that he felt cautiously hopeful. The world's media covered the finding with expectation. However, several experts expressed doubts from the first moment. The signal detected had a frequency of 33.3 kHz, not the 37.5 emitted by certified flight recorders. In addition, the detection system has an effective range of approximately 1.5 kilometers, which made it physically unlikely that it had captured stationary signals from points separated by kilometers. The autonomous submarine deployed to photograph the seabed covered the area for 21 days and found nothing. On April 28, Australian authorities also discontinued the surface search. 52 days had passed without finding a single fragment of aircraft. The next phase was the most costly and systematic. The ATSB coordinated an unprecedented operation. First, a complete bathymetric survey of the area was carried out, mapping the topography of the seabed with a precision until then unprecedented in that region. The result revealed an underwater landscape of extraordinary complexity: canyons several kilometers deep, volcanic mountain chains, plains of fine sediment interspersed with rocky outcrops. The floor of the southern Indian Ocean was, in many senses, one of the most difficult terrains on the planet for an underwater search. Between October 2014 and January 2017, a fleet of vessels equipped with side-scan sonar explored approximately 120,000 square kilometers of the seabed at depths of between 1,000 and 6,000 meters. The sonar equipment was dragged at speeds of 4 or 5 knots, generating acoustic images of strips of seabed a few kilometers wide. Each pass took hours, and the complete process of covering the designated area required more than 2 years. The total cost of the operation exceeded 160 million Australian dollars. When it ended, the area designated as most probable had been examined exhaustively. The aircraft was not there. While the official search was underway, an unusual phenomenon took shape in parallel. Dozens of engineers, mathematicians, pilots, and scientists spread around the world began collaborating informally to analyze the publicly available data about the flight. They communicated through blogs, internet forums, and email lists, sharing calculations and refuting hypotheses with a rigor that in many cases equaled and occasionally surpassed that of the official teams. This group came to be known as the Independent Group, or IG. Among its members were figures such as Mike Exner, a veteran satellite communications engineer who had worked on the first GPS systems. Duncan Steele, a New Zealand space scientist who published the details of the orbital mechanics of the Inmarsat 3F1 satellite on his personal website, or Victor Ianello, a doctor of science from MIT who years later published reference analyses on the flight's trajectory. The work of the IG was notable for several reasons. First, they managed to reconstruct Inmarsat's BFO algorithm before the authorities published the complete data from the clues contained in the partially declassified official documents. Second, they identified with precision the exact times of each ping, which turned out to be slightly different from the regular intervals that the authorities had initially suggested. And third, they established that the BTO data were consistent with a straight-line flight during the final hours, which suggested that the aircraft had been on autopilot. A crucial part of the IG's work was determining at what speed the aircraft had flown during the final hours of flight. This was essential because speed, combined with the ping arcs, made it possible to calculate the exact position of the aircraft at each moment and therefore trace its complete route. Brian Anderson, a New Zealand engineer and member of the IG, developed a technique based on the observation that at some point between two of the pings, the aircraft must have reached its point of maximum proximity to the satellite, that is, the moment when the distance between the aircraft and the satellite was minimal. By calculating that instant with precision, it was possible to derive the average speed in that segment. The result pointed to a cruising speed of around 490 knots, slightly above the usual, suggesting that the aircraft was flying fast, possibly in economic speed mode compensating for headwinds. The publication by Malaysian authorities of the raw Inmarsat data on May 27, 2014, after months of pressure, was the trigger for an acceleration in the IG's work. The data also revealed the behavior of the satellite system in the moment immediately before the blackout. At 18:03 UTC, Inmarsat attempted to transmit a message to the aircraft and received no response, confirming that the SDU was disconnected at that instant. The reconnection at 18:25 was interpreted as a deliberate reboot. A detail of the Inmarsat data that the IG analyzed with particular attention was the behavior of the aircraft's satellite communications system. In the signal log, there was an interruption. At 18:03 UTC, when the satellite attempted to send a message to the aircraft, it did not respond. 22 minutes later, at 18:25, it was the aircraft itself that initiated a reconnection sequence with the satellite, as if the system had rebooted. The ATSB, the Australian Transport Safety Authority, concluded in its official report that this was consistent with a communications terminal power-up and power-down cycle. To reach that state, someone or something had disconnected and reconnected the aircraft's satellite system. This circumstance would have profound implications for the theories about what had occurred on board, because the switch that controls that system is not located in the flight deck, but in an electronic compartment in the aircraft's fuselage that pilots normally do not need to access. The Boeing 777, like all large modern commercial aircraft, concentrates its critical electronic systems in a specific compartment known as the E/E bay, short for Electronics and Equipment Bay. On the 777, this compartment is located beneath the floor of the passenger cabin in the front part of the aircraft and is accessible during flight through an unlocked hatch located in the floor of the first-class cabin. The E/E bay houses the flight computers, inertial navigation systems, pressurization controls, and, relevant to this case, the cable that connects the Inertial Reference System, or IRS, to the Satellite Data Unit, or SDU. It is this unit that manages communications with the Inmarsat satellite and that generates the BFO values that investigators later used to determine the flight's trajectory. In the specific case of MH370, the aircraft was equipped with an SDU manufactured by Honeywell. This system performs the Doppler compensation of its signals computationally. It takes the aircraft's position and velocity data from the IRS through a 3mm cable, calculates the expected Doppler shift, and adjusts the transmission frequency accordingly. If someone disconnected the IRS cable and connected it to a device that generated false position and velocity data, the SDU would transmit to the satellite at an incorrect frequency, producing BFO values that would not correspond to the aircraft's real position. Matt Willemin, a former Australian 777 pilot, wrote a master's thesis in June 2013, months before the disappearance of MH370, warning precisely about the vulnerabilities of the E/E bay. In that document, he pointed out that the in-flight access hatch, combined with the public availability of technical information about the systems housed in that compartment, represented a potentially catastrophic security risk. The thesis described that from the E/E bay, it was possible to use a standard portable maintenance access terminal, the PMAT, to monitor and potentially interfere with the aircraft's systems. It also pointed out that the compartment housed the pilot's oxygen cylinders and the controls of the system that locks the flight deck door. Willimin sent his thesis to several industry groups, including Emirates. The response was that the area was supervised by cabin crew and surveillance cameras, and that it was not considered a significant risk. The cameras, however, are only actively monitored when someone requests access to the flight deck. The flight crew does not continuously supervise that space during trips. Mike Exner, while preparing his visit to a 777 simulator to investigate what happened when an aircraft of that type ran out of fuel, asked the pilots accompanying him how the SDU was turned off and on. The answer was that there is no procedure to do it from the flight deck. The only method is to locate a specific circuit breaker in the E/E bay. None of the pilots present had received training on that procedure. The fact that MH370's SDU had turned off and on again during the flight, combined with the absence of any standard procedure to do it from the flight deck, pointed to a physical intervention in the E/E bay. The Inmarsat data presented an internal contradiction that the official investigators never managed to resolve completely. The BTO values were consistent with a straight-line flight at speeds characteristic of a 777's cruise, between 420 and 480 knots, depending on the segment. This image was consistent with an aircraft on autopilot following a predefined trajectory toward the south. The BFO values, on the other hand, suggested a more irregular trajectory, or a different speed, or both. The ATSB commissioned 5 independent teams, including one from Boeing, to analyze the data and determine the most likely route. They generated thousands of virtual trajectories and evaluated them by their fit to the data. The result was a wide range of possible routes that converged in different areas of the southern Indian Ocean. No analysis managed to perfectly reconcile the BTO and BFO data into a single coherent trajectory. The official search area was the result of that compromise, a 600 nautical mile arc that attempted to cover simultaneously the areas preferred by different analyses. The ATSB acknowledged in its internal documents that even under the best conditions, its interpretation of the BFO data could produce routes with errors of several hundred kilometers. An additional aspect that complicated the picture was the question of the origin of the data. The BTO values, which measure the signal propagation time and are therefore independent of the aircraft's electronic behavior, seemed more robust as position indicators. The BFO values, on the other hand, depended on the Doppler compensation calculated by the SDU from the aircraft's navigation data that in principle was internal to the aircraft and not externally verifiable. If someone had manipulated the data that the SDU received from the IRS, the resulting BFO values would be incorrect. The BTO values, calculated from the physical propagation time of the signal, would be much more difficult to falsify since they depend on the real distance between the aircraft and the satellite. This distinction was central in the most elaborate alternative theory about the disappearance of MH370. Jeff Wise, a science journalist specialized in aviation who covered the case for CNN and Slate, proposed a hypothesis that started from a concrete question. What would happen if the BFO values had been deliberately manipulated to create a false trail? For that manipulation to be possible, several technical conditions would have to be met. The aircraft would have to be equipped with a Honeywell SDU, not Rockwell Collins, because only the former performs Doppler compensation computationally from external data. The aircraft would have to be a Boeing, not an Airbus, because only Boeings have the E/E bay accessible during flight from the passenger cabin. And someone on board would have to know how to disconnect the IRS cable and connect it to a device that generated false position data, a device that would not exist as a commercial product and would have to have been manufactured specifically for that purpose. MH370 met all those requirements. The theory proposed that the authors of the hijacking would have studied the Air France 447 case to understand what information might be recorded in the aircraft's communication systems. By doing so, they would have learned that Inmarsat recorded the BFO values. What they would not have known is that Inmarsat had also begun recording the BTO values starting in 2013, precisely as a consequence of the AF 447 accident. Those BTO values, much more difficult to falsify because they depend on the physical propagation time of the signal, would be the only authentic trace of the aircraft's real trajectory. If the BFO data are ignored and one works only with the BTO, the image that emerges is different. The BTO values are consistent with an aircraft flying in a straight line at speeds between 420 and 500 knots for approximately 6 hours from the Strait of Malacca. If that trajectory is projected northward, the aircraft would pass over the Andaman Islands, cross the Indian subcontinent, continue along the borders between India, Nepal and China, cross Afghanistan and end in Kazakhstan. What makes this possibility technically intriguing is that the BTO values, by depending exclusively on the physical propagation time of the signal between the satellite and the aircraft, are much more difficult to alter artificially than the BFO. To modify a BTO value, one would have to change the real distance between the aircraft and the satellite at the moment of the ping, something that would require physically moving the aircraft or delaying the signal inside the SDU through hardware manipulations that are not documented as possible. The BFO values, on the other hand, derive from an internal calculation of the SDU processor that takes as input the position and velocity data provided by the IRS. Data that can indeed be replaced by an external source. This asymmetry in the manipulability of both parameters is the technical core of the argument in favor of the deception theory. There is a notable geographic detail in that northern route. The aircraft, according to that model, would have systematically flown over borders between countries instead of penetrating their airspaces. It would have crossed the area between Singapore Control and Ho Chi Minh Control, flown over the boundary between Kuala Lumpur and Bangkok, and later navigated along the borders between India and China in the disputed regions of Kashmir. Controllers on both sides of each border could have assumed that the traffic corresponded to the other's airspace. A former RAF navigator, Steve Pearson, who later worked as an avionics systems engineer for the Royal Air Force Warfare Centre, confirmed to Wise that this tactic had precedence. In the military context, flying along the boundaries of Flight Information Regions, or FYRs, was an effective way to transit without being interrogated, because each controller on the side of the border assumed that the aircraft was under the other's responsibility. The northern trajectory, drawn so that it intersects the ping arcs at the correct speeds, would take the aircraft to the vicinity of Kyzylorda in southern Kazakhstan just before the last ping recorded at 0:19 UTC. A few minutes' flight from that point, in a northwesterly direction, there is an extraordinarily peculiar aerodrome, Yubileyny. The Baikonur Cosmodrome is a geopolitical anomaly of the first order. Located in sovereign Kazakh territory, it is administered exclusively by Russia through a lease agreement. Yuri Gagarin departed from there in 1961, and for decades it was the only place in the world from which astronauts could reach the International Space Station. Russia operates it as autonomous territory, a kind of extraterritorial enclave in the steppes of Central Asia. Within the limits of the Cosmodrome, separated from the active launch facilities and surrounded by disused structures, there is a landing strip called Yubileyny, which in Russian means Jubilee. It was built in the 70s as part of the Soviet Buran space shuttle program, the Russian equivalent of the American space shuttle. The runway measures almost 4,700 meters in length, is built with reinforced concrete of exceptional specifications, and was designed and used specifically for the autonomous landing of an aircraft with no pilot on board. On November 15, 1988, the Buran completed its only unmanned orbital flight and landed at Yubileyny completely automatically, deviating less than 15 meters from the target position. After the dissolution of the USSR, the program was cancelled and the runway was abandoned. Today, the area is practically deserted, far from the Cosmodrome's active operations. The Boeing 777 has a Category 3 automatic landing system, known as Autoland, capable of executing complete approaches and landings without pilot intervention, provided that the destination aerodrome has the corresponding ILS equipment. The question of whether Yubileyny has that system has no public answer. What is certain is that the runway was expressly designed to be used by an aircraft without a pilot, which places it in a unique category within the world's airport infrastructure. Wise argued in his analysis that the combination of these elements, the exceptional length and strength of the runway, its design for autonomous landings, its location in de facto Russian territory in Central Asia, and its geographic isolation, made it the only place in the world that brought together all the characteristics that a covert landing of MH370 would have required. The hypothesis of Russian intervention in the disappearance of MH370 did not arise in a vacuum. It developed in a specific geopolitical context that Wise considered significant. On March 6, 2014, 2 days before the disappearance of MH370, President Barack Obama signed an executive order imposing sanctions against individuals and entities responsible for actions that undermine democratic processes in Ukraine. The context was Russia's annexation of Crimea, which had begun days earlier with the infiltration of Russian special forces into Ukrainian territory, an operation designed to look like an internal uprising but executed by elite Russian military units, including Spetsnaz forces. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov responded to the sanctions by declaring that they would inevitably have a boomerang effect on the United States. The next day, MH370 disappeared. On July 16, 2014, 4 months later, Obama announced new sanctions against Russia. Putin responded publicly by warning that sanctions generally have a boomerang effect. The next day, July 17th, Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370, another Boeing 777 from the same company, was shot down over eastern Ukraine, killing the 298 people on board. A later analysis of social media images coordinated by the open-source intelligence group Bellingcat identified the Buk missile launcher that shot down the aircraft as belonging to Russia's 53rd Anti-Aircraft Missile Brigade based in Kursk. Wise noted that the probability that 2 Malaysia Airlines Boeing 777s would be destroyed within 4 months by coincidence was infinitesimal. At the start of 2014, Malaysia Airlines operated 15 aircraft of that type in a global commercial fleet of approximately 19,000 aircraft. The safety record of the 777 was practically impeccable. No flight of this model had recorded fatalities due to mechanical failure during flight. To execute an operation of the complexity that the hijacking of MH370 would require, Russia would be one of the few actors with sufficient aerospace technical capability. As Professor Mark Galeotti, then at New York University, author of works on Russian security forces, pointed out, the Russian intelligence apparatus has what internally they call an active reserve. Individuals who have formally left the security service but maintain a covert operational link with it, placed in civilian jobs and activated when required. A direct precedent of this model was Igor Girkin, known as Strelkov, who led the separatist forces in the Ukrainian Donbass under the appearance of an ordinary citizen, while the European Union identified him as an officer of the GRU, the Russian military intelligence agency. When the Malaysian authorities asked all the countries whose citizens were travelling on board MH370 to conduct background checks, all countries cooperated, all except 2, Russia and Ukraine. The only Russian passenger on board was Nikolai Brodsky, a 43-year-old businessman from Irkutsk who was travelling in business class seat 3K. Brodsky was returning from a diving trip in Bali that he had cut short by 3 days, according to initial reports, to have dinner with his wife on International Women's Day. His wife, Elena, gave several interviews to Russian media in which she declared that she believed her husband was still alive and that he would return to tell everything. Shortly afterwards, she stopped speaking to the press. Through investigators hired in Russia, Wise gathered information about Brodsky's profile. He had been a high-level technical diver, an expert in the use of trimix gas mixtures that allow descents to depths of up to 300 meters, equipment commonly used in commercial diving and with restricted access. He was an instructor at his diving club and had regularly dived under the ice in Lake Baikal. A fellow club member described him as someone with a very good mindset, stress resistance, calm in any situation. His decision to travel to Bali was described as unusual, since he was not fond of warm water diving. His eldest son, Liev, declared that he had had no contact with his father between the ages of 19 and 29, a period about which he had no direct information. The other two passengers of interest were the Ukrainians Ola Chustrak and Serhei Deineka, 45 years old each, both ethnically Russian citizens from Odessa who were traveling together in seats 27D and 27E. There was no presence of these men in the media or on social networks, except for newly created Google Plus profiles that contained no substantial biographical information. Wise hired translators and investigators in Ukraine to try to contact the families. The efforts ran into a series of unusual obstacles. An individual who initially presented himself as the family's lawyer turned out not to be registered with the Ukrainian Bar Association. When this was pointed out, he admitted that he was not a lawyer and said that he would consult with his international legal team. Days later, Wise received a call from a prominent American aviation lawyer, a Harvard graduate with a record before the Supreme Court, who represented the Ukrainian families and declined to provide any additional information. The company listed as the employer of one of the Ukrainians, Nika Mebel, was an upholstered furniture company that operated only online, had no physical address, accepted only cash payments, and had its Google Plus page with exactly two members, Chustrak and Deineka. When a translator called the company, the man who answered denied knowing either of them. In a later call, the same company confirmed that one of them had worked there. Wise was explicit in pointing out that none of the above constituted evidence that these individuals had participated in any illicit act and that they should be treated above all as victims. The set of circumstances was consistent with the Russian hypothesis, but could also have completely innocent explanations. On July 17, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 was covering the route between Amsterdam and Kuala Lumpur at 10,000 meters of altitude over eastern Ukraine. At 16:20 local time, a Buk missile destroyed it in the air, killing the 298 people on board, including 196 Dutch citizens. The Joint Investigation Team, a multinational criminal investigation team led by the Netherlands, concluded that the missile had been fired from territory controlled by pro-Russian separatist forces with a launcher belonging to the 53rd Anti-Aircraft Brigade of the Russian Federation. 4 people were convicted in absentia by a Dutch court in 2022, including 3 Russian citizens and 1 Ukrainian citizen. Russia denied any involvement. The chronological parallel with the sanctions was pointed out by several analysts. Obama's new sanctions were announced on July 16th. MH370 was shot down on the 17th. Obama announced sanctions on March 6th. MH370 disappeared on the 8th. In both cases, the Russian foreign minister had used the boomerang metaphor a few hours before the incident. MH370 demonstrated something that until then was an assumption in the analysis of MH370. That the Russian government was capable of making decisions that resulted in the mass death of international civilians, including citizens of Western powers, as a measure within a broader geopolitical conflict. The argument that no rational state actor would do something like that was weakened by the facts. Wise's theory about MH370 did not require the mystery to necessarily be an act of the Russian state. What it proposed was that if the plane was not in the Indian Ocean and if the BFO data had been falsified, then the technical sophistication of the operation pointed to a state actor with advanced aerospace capability. Russia was, in that logic, the most plausible candidate. But the hypothesis remained and remains without confirmation. For almost 16 months after the disappearance, no physical fragment of the plane appeared. Then, on July 29, 2015, a cleaning worker on the beach of Saint-André on Réunion, a French island in the Indian Ocean, found a fragment of what appeared to be an aileron. It was a flaperon, part of the control surface of an aircraft wing. Subsequent analysis confirmed that the fragment belonged to MH370. The internal serial number matched the aircraft's maintenance records. It was the first physical evidence of the disappearance, found 515 days after the plane's disappearance on an island approximately 4,000 kilometers west of the search area. The flaperon was transferred to France for technical analysis. Experts from the BEA, the French Air Accident Investigation Authority, carried out a detailed forensic examination. The panel showed signs of deterioration consistent with long exposure to the marine environment, as well as marine organisms embedded in its surfaces. The fractures in the material were the subject of structural analysis. Some Boeing engineers and independent experts pointed out that the damage pattern was compatible with a violent high-speed impact, which suggested that the plane had not descended smoothly but had crashed into the water at high speed and in an uncontrolled position. Other experts disagreed, arguing that deterioration from prolonged flotation could produce similar fracture patterns and that it was not possible to draw firm conclusions about the type of impact solely from the state of that piece. The controversy surrounding the flaperon had direct implications for the debate over the state of the plane in its final moments. If the impact had been at high speed, it suggested that the plane was falling in an uncontrolled spiral when it reached the water, which in turn implied that no one was actively piloting it. If the impact had been more controlled, it opened the possibility that someone had attempted a planned ditching, or at least that the plane had maintained some stability in its final descent. In the following years, more fragments appeared. A total of 33 pieces identified as belonging or probably belonging to MH370 have been found on beaches in the Western Indian Ocean, on Reunion Island, in Madagascar, in Mozambique, in Tanzania, in South Africa, and in the Maldives. Among the confirmed pieces were a horizontal stabilizer panel, a fragment of an inner aileron, a piece of fuselage skin with the Malaysia Airlines color scheme, and several pieces of cabin interior. Passengers' personal effects were also located, including a backpack with clothing and a wooden beam from Indonesia that was part of the documented luggage. The analysis of ocean currents and the modeling of the drift of these remains was used by the ATSB and by independent researchers to try to reconstruct the impact area. Oceanographer David Griffin from Australia's CSIRO developed drift models that back-projected the route of the fragments from the finding points to the probable point of origin. His analyses were consistent with an impact on the arc of the seventh ping in an area of the southern Indian Ocean, although with margins of uncertainty of hundreds of kilometers. The problem is that drift models are sensitive to many variables and produce results with wide margins of error. Different analyses agree that the impact point would be on the arc of the seventh ping, but disagree on its exact location along that arc, which is thousands of kilometers long. The fragments found are consistent with an impact in the southern Indian Ocean, but they do not allow the location to be specified with the accuracy necessary to organize a focused underwater search. In January 2017, the official search was suspended. Australia, Malaysia, and China, which had jointly financed it, agreed that without new clues about the exact location of the plane, continuing to explore the seabed randomly lacked justification. In January 2018, a private company called Ocean Infinity resumed the search under a no-find, no-fee agreement with the Malaysian government. It deployed a fleet of state-of-the-art autonomous underwater vehicles and explored approximately 112,000 additional square kilometers in 3 months. It did not find the plane. More than a decade after the disappearance, the picture of what is known with certainty is surprisingly limited for an investigation of this scope. It is known that MH370 deliberately abandoned its planned route and executed a 180-degree turn. It is known that the plane was piloted by someone with knowledge of air navigation, because it followed routes from waypoint to waypoint. It is known that the satellite communications system was disconnected and reconnected during the flight through a procedure that requires physical access to the E/E bay. It is known that the plane exchanged signals with the Inmarsat satellite for approximately 6 hours after disappearing from radar. And it is known that physical fragments of the plane have been found in the Western Indian Ocean. The final report of the Malaysian investigation team, published in July 2018, was notable both for what it contained and for what it avoided. Its 495 pages documented the verified facts with technical exhaustiveness, the chronology of the signals, the analyses of the satellite data, the results of the underwater search. However, as to who had diverted the plane and for what purpose, the report reached no conclusion. It stated that no scenario could be ruled out, including the intervention of a third person on board, and declared that the cause of the accident remained undetermined. The report did make a technical observation that many analysts overlooked. In the period between 1828 and 1941 UTC, the available data were insufficient to determine the plane's trajectory with any degree of precision. This meant that there was more than 1 hour of flight just before the plane presumably stabilized on the final route toward the south, about which practically nothing was known. What is not known is exactly where the bulk of the plane's remains are. It is not known who took control of the flight or for what purpose. It is not known whether the passengers and crew survived the initial diversion or whether they died during the flight. It is not known whether the BFO data are reliable or whether they were manipulated. And it is not known why, if the southern trajectory is correct, the most exhaustive underwater search in the history of aviation found nothing in the indicated area. Independent researchers such as Victor Iannello and the British mathematician Richard Godfrey have continued publishing detailed technical analyses. Iannello considers that the available data point to the plane being on the arc of the 7th ping, but in an area farther south than was searched in the original search, possibly beyond the southern limit of the examined area. This hypothesis is consistent with the possibility that the plane, upon running out of fuel, did not immediately enter a descending spiral but glided for some time before impacting the water, extending the distance traveled compared to what the initial models had estimated. Godfrey, for his part, has developed an analysis based on the long-range HF radio wave detection system called WSPR-NET, originally designed for amateur communications. His thesis is that the disturbances in the propagation of radio signals recorded on that network during the night of March 8, 2014 are consistent with the presence of a large object the size of a Boeing 777 in certain positions along a northern route. The methodology has been criticized by other researchers as statistically inconclusive, but it has generated an active technical debate within the community. Other investigations point in a different direction. In 2023, oceanographer Richard Coleman presented an acoustic analysis that identified a signal recorded by the CTBTO nuclear explosion monitoring system at the moment when MH370 would have impacted the ocean according to the most accepted models. The signal came from a position compatible with a notably more northerly latitude than the main search area, around 25 degrees south latitude, which would open a new search corridor if the analysis proves valid. In March 2024, the 10th anniversary of the disappearance, the Malaysian government announced that it was evaluating a new proposal from Ocean Infinity to resume the search, this time concentrated on a smaller and better defined area based on the analyses accumulated over the last decade. The company proposed expanding coverage toward the south and toward areas adjacent to the area already explored. In May 2025, the government of Malaysia confirmed that it had reached an agreement with Ocean Infinity for a new search campaign, although the operational details and the start schedule were still subject to negotiation at the time this information was published. The plane remains unfound. The 239 people traveling on board remain unlocated. The black boxes, if they still exist in a condition to be recovered, contain the flight data and cockpit voice recordings from the final hours of MH370, the information that could answer once and for all what happened in the cockpit of that plane that early morning.